The clock on the bedside table ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical indifference, slicing through the heavy silence of the master bedroom. It was 10 p.m., the hour of the ritual. Outside, the rain of a typical Seattle spring drummed against the window pane, a cold and relentless sound that seemed to mirror the damp chill settling in Sarah's bones. The door creaked open and Ethan stepped in. A year ago, his entrance would have been heralded by the smell of expensive cologne and the cheerful jingle of his car keys. Now, he carried only a glass of water and a small, ceramic saucer. On that saucer sat a single white pill. "Time for your recovery supplement, honey," Ethan said. His voice was a low murmur, devoid of the vibrance that used to define him. Sarah adjusted herself against the pillows, her movements slow and deliberate. Her chest still felt tight, a constant reminder of the jagged scar hidden beneath her silk nightgown, the mark where surgeons had cracked open her ribcage to mend a failing heart. She was saved, they told her, but as she looked at her husband, she felt more like a ghost haunting a house that was no longer hers. Ethan reached out to hand her the glass. As their fingers brushed, Sarah felt a jolt of cold realization. His hands, once the steady hands of a man who spent his days signing contracts and typing memos, were trembling. Not a violent shake, but a fine, rhythmic tremor of sheer physical exhaustion. She looked down at his grip. His knuckles were swollen, and the skin was stained with a stubborn, dark grime that no amount of scrubbing seemed to reach. "Ethan," she whispered, her eyes traveling up to his face. "You're shaking." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were the most heartbreaking part, deep, hollow craters of fatigue rimmed with bloodshot red. "Just a long day at the office, Sarah. The Henderson account is a nightmare. You know how it is." He was lying. She knew the cadence of his lies now. They were too rehearsed, too polished. The Ethan she married was an open book, a man who laughed with his whole body and wore his heart on his sleeve. This man was a vault, locked tight and rusted shut. "You look like you're disappearing," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rising resentment. "You're never home for dinner. You leave the second you think I'm asleep. Is the Henderson account really that demanding, or is there someone else?" The accusation hung in the sterile air like a poisonous gas. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of his body causing the mattress to groan. He looked at her with a tenderness that felt like a goodbye. "There is no one else, Sarah. There could never be anyone else. I'm just trying to keep us afloat. Everything is expensive now. The meds, the therapy, the mortgage. I just need you to get better. That's your only job. Please." He held the pill out again. To the world, it was a gesture of care. To Sarah, it felt like a sentence. For the past 3 months, this supplement had been her nightly companion. Ethan claimed it was a specialized sedative booster to help her heart rest during the most critical hours of repair. And it worked. Within 15 minutes of swallowing it, a heavy, velvet curtain would drop over her consciousness, dragging her into a dreamless void until the sun rose. But lately, the void felt like a prison. She began to wonder, was he medicating her for her health, or was he medicating her for his convenience? Was he drugging her so he could slip away into the night to find the warmth and vitality she could no longer provide? The thought was a jagged shard of glass in her mind, cutting her every time she breathed. "Drink," he urged gently. Sarah took the pill. She placed it on her tongue, the bitter chalkiness stinging her throat. She took a sip of water, watched by Ethan's intense, focused gaze. He watched her swallow with a desperation that was almost frightening. It was as if her falling asleep was the only thing keeping his world from imploding. "Good girl," he whispered, leaning in to kiss her forehead. His skin felt like ice. He stayed by her side for a few minutes, stroking her hair. Sarah closed her eyes, pretending to let the familiar lethargy take hold. She felt his thumb trace the line of her jaw, a gesture of such profound sadness that she almost wept. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it. "I'm so sorry it has to be this way." She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab his collar and demand to know what he was sorry for. Was he sorry for the affair? For the lies? For the fact that he no longer loved a broken woman? But the supplement, was already beginning to work its dark magic. Her limbs felt like they were being filled with lead. Her thoughts, once sharp and accusing, began to blur at the edges. Ethan stood up. He moved with the caution of a man walking through a minefield. He adjusted the blankets around her, tucked her in as if she were a porcelain doll, and then turned off the bedside lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Sarah lay perfectly still, fighting the overwhelming urge to drift. She focused on the sound of his footsteps. Click, click, click. The sound of his dress, shoes hitting the hardwood floor. Then, the silence of the hallway. A few moments later, she heard the muffled sound of the bathroom door closing, followed by the rush of the shower. This was the pattern. He would shower, change, and then, thinking she was dead to the world, he would leave. Sarah bit the inside of her cheek, the sharp pain providing a temporary anchor to reality. She couldn't let the sleep take her. Not tonight. The doubt had become a physical weight, heavier than the debt, heavier than the surgery. She needed to know who Ethan was when the lights were out. She needed to know if the man who saved her life was now the man who was destroying her soul. In the dark, Sarah's hand drifted to her chest, feeling the steady, artificial rhythm of her mended heart. Thump thump, thump thump. It was a miracle of modern medicine, a second chance that had cost them everything they owned. Their savings were gone. Their 401k had been liquidated. They were living on credit and prayers in an America where a single illness could erase a lifetime of hard work. Was that it? Was the stress of the poverty just too much for him? The shower stopped. A few minutes later, she heard the bedroom door open a crack. A sliver of light hit the carpet. She sensed Ethan standing there, watching her. She kept her breathing shallow and rhythmic, mimicking the deep sleep of the drugged. Finally, the door closed. She heard his muffled footsteps heading downstairs. Then, the distinct, heavy thud of the front door locking. Sarah opened her eyes. The room was spinning, the sedative pulling at her mind like an undertow. Her vision was clouded, and her heart raced with a fear that transcended her physical condition. She forced herself to sit up. The world tilted dangerously. Her stomach churned. With a groan of pure willpower, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet hit the cold floor, and she shivered. "Not tonight!" she hissed to herself, her voice a raspy ghost of its former self. Tonight, the secret's end. She reached into her nightstand and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking as badly as Ethan's had been. She looked at the screen, the brightness blinding her. It was 10:45 p.m. Ethan was gone. He was out there in the night, moving through the shadows of the city they once loved, leaving her behind in a drug-induced haze. Sarah stood up, gripping the bedpost for support. Every muscle protested, and her chest ached with a dull, throbbing pressure. She didn't put on a robe. She didn't grab her purse. She simply moved toward the window, pulling back the blind just enough to see the taillights of Ethan's old, battered truck disappearing around the corner. He wasn't heading toward the freeway. He was heading toward the industrial district, the part of town where the lights were dim and the secrets were buried deep. Sarah felt a tear track down her cheek, cold and bitter. She realized then that the white pill wasn't just medicine. It was a shroud. And tonight, she was going to tear it off, no matter how much it hurt to see the light. The sleep was never a gentle descent. For Sarah, it was a brutal, artificial severance from the world. It felt like a heavy, velvet curtain, soaked in lead, dropping without warning across the stage of her consciousness. One moment she would be tracing the patterns of the ceiling shadows, and the next, her mind would be plunged into a dense, viscous void. There were no dreams there, only a terrifying blankness that felt less like rest and more like a temporary death. When she woke each morning, it wasn't with the freshness of a new day, but with a chemical hangover that made her limbs feel like they were made of cooling iron. She would claw her way back to the surface of reality, her head throbbing, only to find Ethan already gone or sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee with a 1,000-yard stare. This was the geometry of absence. It was the way the space between them had transformed from a bridge into a chasm, defined by the things Ethan didn't say and the places he wasn't supposed to be. On this particular morning, the sun was a pale, apologetic sliver through the blinds. Sarah lay still, her heart thumping a jagged rhythm against her ribs. She remembered the previous night, the pill she had hidden under her tongue and later spat into the trash, the way she had watched his truck disappear into the rainy dark. She hadn't followed him, not yet. The sedative's ghost still haunted her nervous system, leaving her too weak to drive. But she had stayed awake long enough to hear him return at 4:30 a.m. She rolled over to his side of the bed. It was cold. Ethan had already showered and left for his office at 7 a.m. But as she buried her face in his pillow, the scent hit her. It wasn't the crisp, citrusy scent of his expensive shaving cream or the lingering aroma of the mahogany-scented candle she used to buy. It was something acrid and industrial. The sharp, pungent bite of diesel fuel. The heavy, metallic tang of oxidized iron. And something else, the faint, earthy smell of wet concrete. Sarah sat up abruptly, her head spinning. These were not the scents of an account executive at a high-end firm in downtown Seattle. These were the smells of the docks, of the shipyards, of the brutal, bone-grinding world of manual labor. The Henderson account, she whispered to the empty room, the name feeling like ash in her mouth. She climbed out of bed, her legs trembling. She felt like a detective in her own home, a stranger trespassing in a life she no longer recognized. She walked to the laundry hamper in the corner of the bathroom. Ethan usually did the laundry himself now, another favor he insisted on to spare her the strain. She reached inside and pulled out the dress shirt he had worn the day before. On the surface, it looked fine, but when she turned the cuffs inside out, she saw it. There, embedded in the white cotton, was a smear of dark, gritty grease that no detergent could fully erase. And the fingernail marks. She remembered the night before, how his hands had looked in the dim light. She recalled a moment from 2 days ago. She had reached out to massage his shoulders, a simple gesture of affection she hadn't offered in weeks. The moment her palms touched the base of his neck, Ethan had let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. He had flinched away as if she had branded him with a hot iron. "Just a bit of tension, Sarah," he had snapped, his voice uncharacteristically harsh before softening. "I've been sitting at the desk too long. My posture is terrible." But the flinch hadn't felt like a stiff muscle. It had felt like a deep, structural agony. It was the reaction of a man whose body was being pushed past the point of breaking. Sarah walked to the kitchen, her mind racing. She opened the junk drawer, looking for something. She wasn't even sure what. Her eyes fell on Ethan's toolbox, tucked away in the back of the pantry. He was never a handy man. He usually called a professional for anything more complicated than changing a light bulb. She pulled the heavy metal box onto the counter. Her breath hitched. The handles were caked in a fine, gray dust, the same dust she had seen on his boots. She opened the lid. Inside, nestled among the screwdrivers and wrenches, was a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. She picked them up. They were stiff, the leather hardened by sweat and grime. The palms were worn thin, and the knuckles were stained with dried blood. These weren't the gloves of a hobbyist. These were the tools of a man who spent his nights fighting the earth itself. The geometry of absence was beginning to take a terrifying shape. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that Sarah was too afraid to look at. Why the secrecy? If he had lost his job and taken up labor to pay the bills, why wouldn't he tell her? They had promised for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. But then, she thought of the white pill. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. He wasn't just working, he was hiding the nature of his work. He was drugging her, so she wouldn't see him come home covered in the filth of the city. He was drugging her, so she wouldn't hear him groaning in pain as he climbed into bed. He was drugging her to preserve a version of their life that no longer existed. "You're protecting me," she choked out, a sob rising in her throat. "Or you're ashamed." In the modern American landscape, pride was a jagged thing. Ethan had always been the provider, the golden boy, who had climbed the corporate ladder with ease. To fall from the heights of a glass-walled office to the mud of a construction site, for many men, that was a death of the soul. But it wasn't just pride. Sarah looked at the stack of mail on the counter, the final notice, envelopes from the hospital that Ethan thought he had hidden under a pile of magazines. The debt was a monster, a silent beast that lived in the corners of their house, devouring their future. She realized with a jolt of horror that her life, her very heartbeat, was the reason for the grease on his cuffs and the blood on his gloves. He wasn't having an affair with a person, he was having an affair with survival. And she was the one he was surviving for. Sarah looked at the clock. It was nearly noon. Ethan would be at the office for another 5 hours. But she knew now that the office was a lie. She went to the closet and pulled out her heaviest coat. Her heart fluttered, a warning sign from the mended muscle in her chest, but she ignored it. The medicine had kept her in the dark for too long. The geometry was complete. The lines of his absence led to a single point in the industrial district. She grabbed the spare keys to her car. She didn't care about the risk to her health anymore. She couldn't live in a house built on the broken bones of her husband while she was kept in a chemical stupor. As she walked to the garage, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked pale, fragile, like a piece of porcelain that had been glued back together. But there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there since the surgery. "I'm coming for you, Ethan," she whispered. "No more pills. No more ghosts." The drive toward the city felt like a descent into another world. As the manicured lawns of the suburbs gave way to rusted warehouses and towering cranes, Sarah felt the weight of Ethan's secret pressing down on her. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust and salt from the sound. She navigated by instinct, following the path his truck had taken the night before. She looked for the tallest cranes, the most ambitious skeletons of steel reaching for the gray sky. She looked for the place where a man could disappear into the work and forget that he was supposed to be a husband, a lover, a man of status. She finally saw it, a massive construction site for a new luxury high-rise, ironically named the Zenith. It was a fortress of concrete and iron, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Sarah pulled her car to the curb, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She watched the workers in their neon vests, moving like ants across the massive structure. Somewhere in that chaos of noise and dust was the man who kissed her forehead every night and handed her a lie in a glass of water. She stepped out of the car, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The geometry of his absence had led her here, to the raw, bleeding heart of his sacrifice. And as she looked at the cold steel of the building, she realized that her heart wasn't just mended, it was being held together by the very man she had accused of leaving her. Standing in the center of their open-concept kitchen, Sarah felt like an intruder in a museum dedicated to a dead civilization. The house was beautiful, all quartz countertops, minimalist lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the manicured suburbs of Bellevue. But the life that had once filled these rooms was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. This was the ghost of a marriage. Before the surgery, their home had been a symphony of noise. She remembered a Tuesday night, not even 2 years ago, when Ethan had come home from the office with a bottle of overpriced Cabernet and a wild idea to drive to the Oregon coast for the weekend. They had blasted indie rock through the Sonos speakers, dancing in the kitchen while the pasta boiled over. Ethan's laughter had been a vibrant, booming thing that shook his entire frame. They were loud. They were messy. They were making plans for a house in the south of France, for children with his eyes and her stubbornness, for a future that felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. Now, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic thwack of the neighbor's sprinkler. Ethan had become a master of the hushed life. He spoke in whispers, moved on tiptoe, and avoided eye contact as if her gaze were a spotlight he couldn't endure. The vibrant man who once complained loudly about a bad golf game or a missed promotion had been replaced by a shadow who barely occupied his own skin. Sarah moved to the built-in desk in the hallway, a space usually reserved for organizing invitations and holiday cards. She was looking for the warranty for the dishwasher, which had begun to leak, but as she tugged at the back of the bottom drawer, it stuck. Reaching in to clear the obstruction, her fingers brushed against a thick, manila envelope taped to the underside of the drawer's frame. Her heart skipped a beat, a fluttering, uneven rhythm that made her lightheaded. She pulled it free. It wasn't a warranty. It was a stack of credit card statements from a bank she didn't recognize, an account Ethan had never mentioned. "What are you hiding, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice cracking in the empty hallway. She sat on the floor, her back against the cool drywall, and spread the papers out like a deck of cards. She expected to see evidence of a gambling debt, or perhaps the remnants of their failed savings. But as her eyes scanned the lines of fine print, a different kind of horror began to take shape. The charges were all late night. All of them. 11:42 p.m., Exxon gas station, South Industrial Way. $54.20, 2:15 a.m., 7-Eleven, Harbor Island. $8.15, 3:40 a.m., Shell Convenience, Kent. $12.30, 4:10 a.m., Starbucks, Mobile Order, Soto District. $6.50. The pattern repeated, night after night, for the last 4 months. These weren't the locations of an executive's life. These were the fringes of a city, industrial zones, trucking routes, and the rougher edges of the Seattle metropolitan area. These were places Ethan had no business being in at 3 in the morning. The seed was planted then. It wasn't a sudden explosion of realization, but a slow, poisonous vine that began to wrap itself around her heart. Who is she? The thought was a jagged, ugly thing. She imagined a woman who didn't have a 6-inch scar running down her sternum. A woman who didn't get winded walking up the stairs. A woman who lived in one of those industrial lofts in Soto, someone who offered Ethan the fire and the noise he had lost when his wife became a patient. Sarah looked at the $8.15 charge at the 7-Eleven. What did that buy? A pack of cigarettes, a couple of energy drinks for a long night ahead, 2 coffees. She felt a hot, searing wave of resentment. While she was being drugged into a stupor by the white pill he insisted she take for her recovery, he was out there. He was fueling up his truck in the dead of night to drive to someone else. He was buying snacks at 2 a.m. for a woman who didn't smell like antiseptic and hospital linens. The silence of the house suddenly felt like a mockery. Every "I love you," he whispered before he turned out the light, felt like a brick in a wall of deception. She remembered how he would linger at the door, watching her until her eyes closed. She had thought it was devotion. Now, she saw it as a countdown. He was waiting for the medicine to take hold, so he could escape his burden and return to the living. "I'm not a wife anymore," she choked out, the tears finally breaking through. "I'm just a project he's finished with." She thought back to the vibrant version of Ethan, the man who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. He used to tell her everything, from the mundane details of a board meeting to his secret fear of spiders. But that man had died the day they rolled her into the operating room. The man who came out of that hospital waiting room was a stranger who had learned how to lie with a terrifying, gentle precision. The contrast was unbearable. Before, they had spent their Sundays at the Pike Place Market, arguing over which flowers to buy, their hands constantly intertwined. Now, Ethan spent his Sundays catching up on sleep, his body curled in a tight, defensive ball on his side of the bed, flinching if her foot so much as brushed his leg. Before, they had a shared calendar on their phones, filled with dinner dates, concerts, and flight itineraries. Now, his phone was always face down, protected by a passcode she didn't know, and his office hours had expanded to encompass the entire night. Sarah clutched the statements to her chest. The paper was cold and sharp. In the modern American dream, she realized there was no room for the broken. Everything was about performance, about moving forward, about being invincible. Ethan was a high performer. He was a closer, and she was a liability. The fear of another woman wasn't just about jealousy, it was about the terror of being replaced because she was no longer functional. She felt a deep, primitive shame. Her body had failed him, and now his heart was failing her. She looked at the most recent statement, a charge from 3 nights ago at a diner in the Soto district at 4:30 a.m. The Moonlight Cafe. She knew that place. It was a dive, a place for graveyard shift workers and people who didn't want to be found. "Is that where you take her?" she whispered to the empty hallway. "Do you sit in a vinyl booth and talk about how hard it is to live with a ghost?" The seed of suspicion had taken root, and it was growing fast, fed by the darkness of the white pill and the sterile silence of their home. She felt a sudden, fierce clarity. She couldn't stay in this museum any longer. She couldn't be the porcelain doll he tucked in every night before heading out to his real life. She stood up, her legs steadier than they had been in weeks. The resentment acted like a stimulant, clearing the fog of her medication. She wouldn't ask him. He would only give her another gentle lie, another kiss on the forehead that felt like a betrayal. She would find out for herself. She would follow the trail of gas stations and late-night diners until she saw the face of the woman who had stolen her husband's laughter. As she tucked the manila envelope back into the drawer, Sarah realized that the ghost of a marriage was about to be exorcised. She just didn't know yet that the demon she was hunting was actually an angel in disguise, and that the other woman was a mountain of debt that was slowly crushing the life out of the man she loved. All she knew was that tonight, she wouldn't swallow the pill. Tonight, she would follow the taillights into the dark. Ethan stood in the shadow of the bedroom door, his breath held tight in his chest, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Sarah's shoulders. To anyone else, it was the picture of peace. To him, it was a crime he committed every single night. The glass in his hand felt heavier than a sledgehammer. The white pill, a potent sedative he'd sourced through a friend of a friend under the guise of his own insomnia, was his only way to keep the world from splintering. He hated it. He hated the way it turned her vibrant mind into a quiet, empty room. But more than that, he hated the alternative, Sarah waking up at 2 a.m. to find his side of the bed cold, or worse, seeing him crawl through the door at dawn, covered in the gray silt of a world she wasn't supposed to know existed. The arithmetic of despair. He walked to the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. He could see the numbers burned into the back of his eyelids. $254,312.67. That was the price of her heartbeat. He remembered the day the letter arrived from the insurance company, a cold, sterile document filled with jargon like out-of-network specialty and pre-existing condition clauses. In 10 pages of legal speak, they had essentially told him that Sarah's life wasn't worth the paper the policy was printed on. To the world, Ethan was still the rising star at the firm. But in reality, that world was a house of cards. His salary, which once felt like a small fortune, was being swallowed whole by the interest alone. He had liquidated everything. The stocks, the 401k, the secret fund they had started for a house in the south of France. It had all vanished into the maw of the American healthcare system, leaving behind nothing but a crushing, suffocating debt. A body reborn in grime. He reached for the bottle of ibuprofen on the counter, swallowing 3 tablets without water. His back felt like a map of jagged glass. Every time he moved, a sharp, white-hot pain flared from his lumbar to his shoulder blades, the souvenir of 8 hours spent hauling bags of dry cement and iron rebar at the Zenith construction site. He looked at his hands in the dim light of the microwave clock. They were no longer the hands of a man who signed contracts. They were the hands of a ghost. The skin was split, the calluses were thick and yellowed, and no matter how long he spent under the scalding water of the shower, the smell of diesel and wet earth seemed to have seeped into his very marrow. If she sees these hands, he thought, his throat tightening, she'll know. And if she knows, the guilt will kill the very heart I broke my soul to save. This was his weight of mercy. He believed, with the desperate, narrow logic of a drowning man, Bawa, if he could just carry the burden alone, it wouldn't exist for her. If he could play the villain, the distant husband, the man who might be having an affair, it was better than her knowing she was the reason he was dying in increments every night. The midnight exit. He changed into his work clothes in the garage. A pair of stiff, grease-stained Carhartts, and a thermal shirt that smelled of old sweat. He moved with the practiced silence of a thief. He climbed into his truck, the engine turning over with a reluctant roar that felt deafening in the quiet suburb. He looked back at the darkened window of their bedroom. "Just stay asleep, Sarah," he whispered into the cold air of the cabin. "Just stay in the dream where we're still okay." As he pulled out of the driveway, his heart performed its nightly ritual of breaking. He wasn't heading to a lover. He wasn't heading to a secret life of glamour. He was heading to a hole in the ground where he would trade his dignity and his physical health for another 24 hours of her life. To Ethan, the trade was simple. His exhaustion was a small price for her heartbeat. His pain was the currency of her recovery. And as long as the white pill did its job, he could keep the monster under the bed from ever waking her up. He drove toward the industrial district, the city lights reflecting in the grime of his windshield. He was a man running out of time, running out of health, and running out of lies. But as long as Sarah woke up the next morning without the weight of $250,000 on her chest, he would keep digging his own grave to keep her standing. The concept of normalcy had become a bitter joke to Sarah, a ghost she chased through the echoing hallways of their pristine home. She moved through the rooms with the tentative grace of a piece of fragile porcelain, one that had been shattered and glued back together with expensive, surgical precision. Every time she reached for a heavy pot in the kitchen or tried to stretch her arms to reach a high shelf, she felt the phantom pull of her sternum, a reminder that she was held together by wire and the grace of a surgeon's hand. She was alive, yes, but she felt like a museum exhibit, something to be looked at with pity, something to be dusted carefully, but never something to be truly used or desired. The house, once a sanctuary of shared dreams, now felt like a high-end recovery ward. Ethan had curated the environment with obsessive care. He had installed smart lights that dimmed automatically to soothe her nerves, stocked the pantry with organic supplements she never asked for, and took over every domestic task with a silent, grim efficiency. He was so busy being her caretaker that he had forgotten how to be her husband. Every time she tried to contribute, to fold a basket of laundry or load the dishwasher, he would materialize out of the shadows, his face a mask of exhaustion and alarm, gently prying the items from her hands. "Let me do that, Sarah. You need to rest. The doctor said your heart needs time." The word heart felt like a slur. It was no longer a part of her. It was a mechanical liability that had bankrupted their souls. She began to feel like a colossal, living debt. Every breath she took felt like it was being billed to their credit cards. She would watch Ethan as he sat across from her at dinner, his face illuminated by the flickering light of his phone as he obsessively checked work emails. He looked skeletal. The vibrant man who once loved to grill steaks in the backyard and talk about taking up sailing was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who seemed to be vibrating with an unspoken tension. Sarah felt the crushing weight of his silence. She convinced herself that his distance wasn't born of fatigue, but of resentment. Who could blame him? He was tethered to a broken woman in a house full of bills, his youth being swallowed by the sterile demands of her recovery. One Tuesday afternoon, the rain was a relentless gray sheet against the windows, blurring the world into a smudge of charcoal and slate. Sarah had spent the morning trying to reclaim a sliver of her old self by organizing the books in the library. She found herself sitting on the floor, exhausted after only 20 minutes, her head resting against the mahogany shelf. The house was quiet, or so she thought, until she heard the low, urgent murmur of a voice coming from Ethan's home office. He was supposed to be at the firm, but he had come home early to check on her, only to lock himself away for hours. Sarah stood up, her heart, that expensive, fragile thing, thumping against her ribs. She moved toward the door, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door was cracked just a hair, a sliver of yellow light spilling out into the darkened hall. She stopped, her hand hovering over the wood, as the tone of Ethan's voice reached her. It wasn't the voice he used with her, that soft, patronizing tone of a nurse. This was raw, desperate, and pleading. "I'm telling you, I'll do whatever it takes," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with a jagged edge she had never heard before. "Give me the graveyard shift. Give me the double overs. I don't care about the physical toll. I just need more hours. I can't let this slip. I can't lose the progress we've made." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. More hours. Progress. Whatever it takes. The words twisted in her mind like a knife. In her state of heightened insecurity, her mind didn't go to the construction site or the medical debt. It went to the place where all broken hearts go, the fear of replacement. She imagined a woman on the other end of that line, someone strong, someone whole, someone who lived in a vibrant, high-energy world that Ethan was so clearly desperate to return to. She pictured Ethan pleading for more time with her, wanting to carve out a secret life in the graveyard hours just to escape the suffocating atmosphere of their marriage. "It's getting harder to hide it," Ethan continued, his voice dropping even lower, thick with a sob he was trying to suppress. She's starting to notice. She's asking questions. I'm doing my best to keep her in the dark, but the pressure, it's unbearable. Just tell me when to show up. I'll be there. I'll always be there. Sarah backed away from the door, her vision blurring. The hallway felt like it was narrowing, the walls closing in on her. She's starting to notice. Keep her in the dark. The confirmation was like a physical blow to her chest. He was talking about her. He was talking about their life, as if it were a prison sentence he was trying to negotiate his way out of. He was begging for more time with his real life, a life that didn't involve medicine, scars, and a wife who felt like a ghost. She stumbled back to their bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, the covers still smelling of the industrial, metallic scent that followed Ethan everywhere. She realized now that the scent wasn't from a construction site. In her mind, it was the scent of a secret, the scent of a man who was working hard to build a bridge away from her. The suspicion that had been a small, nagging seed in the previous chapters suddenly bloomed into a massive, poisonous flower. She felt a wave of profound, agonizing shame. She was the anchor dragging him down into the depths, and he was out there, pleading for the hours that would allow him to breathe again. I'm the burden, she whispered into the pillow, the salt of her tears soaking the silk. I'm the thing he has to keep in the dark so he can survive. She thought of the white pill sitting in the saucer on the nightstand, waiting for her. She saw it now for what it truly was, a tool of exclusion. He didn't want her to recover. He wanted her to be silent. He wanted her to be a doll he could set aside while he went out and lived the life she had stolen from him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He had saved her life only to make her a prisoner of his guilt and his secrets. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room, Sarah made a silent vow. She would not be kept in the dark any longer. If Ethan wanted the graveyard hours, she would follow him into the graveyard. She would see for herself the progress he was so desperate to protect. She would confront the other life that made him plead with such devastating urgency. Her heart, the one that had cost him his youth and her his trust, beat with a new, fierce purpose. It wasn't a heartbeat of recovery, it was a heartbeat of war. She would find the truth, even if it meant that the fragile porcelain of their marriage finally shattered into 1,000 pieces that no surgeon could ever hope to mend. The normalcy she had been chasing was dead, and in its place was a cold, hard determination to see the man she loved for who he had truly become, a stranger who considered her his greatest weight to bear. The 6th anniversary of their wedding was supposed to be the milestone of their new life, the first major celebration since Sarah's heart had been mended and their bank accounts had been blood dry. Sarah had spent the afternoon in a state of quiet, desperate hope. She had put on a silk dress that used to flow over her curves, but now hung slightly loose, a reminder of the weight she had lost during the months of white-walled hospital rooms. She had painstakingly prepared a dinner of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes, the scent filling the house with a warmth that felt almost like the old days. She had dimmed the lights, lit 2 tapered candles that cast long, flickering shadows against the quartz countertops and waited. She waited as the clock struck 7. Then 8. By 9, the candles had burned halfway down, their wax weeping in slow, jagged trails. By 10, the rosemary potatoes had shriveled into cold, salty lumps, and the silence of the house had become a deafening roar. Sarah sat at the head of the table, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flame of the remaining candle dance in the draft from the vent. She felt like a character in a Gothic novel, the forgotten wife in a mansion full of secrets. Every tick of the clock was a needle prick to her soul. She thought of the other life she suspected Ethan was leading, the more hours he had pleaded for on the phone. Was he with her now? Was he laughing in a crowded bar while his fragile wife sat alone in the dark? At 11:45 p.m., the heavy thud of the front door echoed through the foyer. Sarah didn't move. She didn't call out. She simply watched the doorway. Ethan stumbled into the light of the kitchen, and for a moment Sarah gasped. He didn't look like a man coming from a lover's arms. He looked like a man who had been dragged through the bowels of the earth. His expensive wool coat was gone, replaced by a thin, stained windbreaker. His hair was matted with a fine, gray grit, and his skin was a sallow, sickly color under the flickering kitchen light. But it was the smell that hit her first, the same acrid, industrial stench that had haunted her dreams. It was the smell of grease, of scorched metal, and the heavy, suffocating scent of diesel fuel. In his hand, he clutched a single, wilted red rose. It was the kind of flower you buy at a 24-hour gas station at midnight. The plastic wrapping was crinkled, and the petals were already turning a bruised, necrotic black at the edges. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking offering. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice sounding as though his throat had been lined with sandpaper. He looked at the table, at the cold food and the guttering candles, and a look of profound, agonizing shame washed over his face. "Oh God! Sarah! I lost track of time. The office. The project. Everything just spiraled." "The project," Sarah repeated, her voice flat and hollow. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She walked toward him, not to embrace him, but to inspect the wreckage of the man she loved. As she got closer, the light caught a dark, wet stain on the sleeve of his light-colored thermal shirt. It wasn't grease. It was a deep, crimson red, soaking through the fabric and beginning to crust at the edges. "You're bleeding, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched violently, his face contorting in a mask of pain before he quickly masked it with a forced, terrifyingly thin smile. "It's nothing," he said, pulling his arm away and tucking it behind his back. "Just a paper cut. You know how it is with those blueprints and the heavy cardstock at the office. I was rushing to finish the filing and I just caught the edge. It looks worse than it is." The lie was so thin it felt like a physical insult. A paper cut didn't soak through a thermal shirt. A paper cut didn't leave a man smelling like a shipyard and looking like he was on the verge of total physical collapse. Sarah looked at the rose in his other hand, the wilted, dying thing, and then back at his eyes. She saw the desperation there, the frantic way he was trying to hold the mask in place, but all she could feel was the searing heat of betrayal. She was convinced that the blood was from a fight, or perhaps an accident at some place he shouldn't have been, or maybe even a mark of a life so chaotic and dark that he couldn't even keep the basic details of his deception straight. "A paper cut," she whispered, a bitter laugh escaping her throat. "Is that what we're calling it now? Is that what you tell yourself when you look at me? That I'm so drugged, so broken, so fragile that I'll believe a paper cut caused you to bleed through your clothes and come home smelling like a mechanic's shop on our anniversary?" "Sarah, please," Ethan said, taking a step toward her. He reached out with his uninjured hand, but she stepped back, the space between them feeling like a canyon. "I'm just tired. I'm so tired. I'm doing this for us. Everything is for us. There is no us in a lie, Ethan," she snapped, the tears finally spilling over. "There is only you and the secrets you keep, and me, the burden you have to manage. Do you think I don't see you disappearing? Do you think I don't smell the world you're hiding in? You gave me a heart so I could live, but you're killing the soul that was supposed to go with it." Ethan looked down at the wilted rose in his hand, and for a second, his composure shattered. His shoulders slumped, and he looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer a better lie. He just stood there in the wreckage of their anniversary, the smell of industrial grime clashing with the faint, sweet scent of the roasting chicken. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a single tear carving a clean path through the dust on his cheek. "I'm so sorry, Sarah." He turned and walked toward the bathroom, his movements slow and agonizing, leaving the wilted rose on the kitchen island. Sarah watched him go, her heart, the expensive, mended miracle, aching with a pain that no surgery could fix. She picked up the rose. The stem was thorny and rough, drawing a tiny bead of blood from her thumb. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the flower, a symbol of their marriage, dying, neglected, and bought in a moment of desperate, last-minute guilt. That night, she didn't wait for him to bring the glass of water and the white pill. She went to the medicine cabinet herself, pulled out the bottle, and stared at the small, chalky tablets. She realized that the anniversary of tears wasn't just about a missed dinner or a thin lie. It was the night the last of her trust evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She would no longer be the victim of his mercy. She would no longer be the porcelain doll kept in a chemical fog. She poured the water down the drain and threw the pill into the trash. She would stay awake. She would watch him. And when he slipped out into the night again, smelling of grease and carrying the weight of his paper cuts, she would be right behind him. She would find the truth, even if that truth was a woman, a crime, or a secret life that would finally end the misery of their perfect recovery. As she sat in the dark living room, listening to the sound of the shower running as Ethan tried to wash away the evidence of his night, Sarah felt her heart harden into something as cold and unyielding as the steel beams of the city. The ghost of their marriage had finally stopped haunting the halls. Tonight, it had died for good. The silence that followed the anniversary of tears was not the peaceful quiet of a home at rest. It was the pressurized, ringing silence of a tomb. For 3 days, Sarah and Ethan moved around each other like celestial bodies trapped in a dying orbit, close enough to feel the gravitational pull of their shared history, but too far apart to touch without burning. The paper cut on Ethan's arm had been bandaged in secret, though Sarah could still see the phantom red stain through the fresh fabric of his shirts. He didn't offer more explanations, and she didn't ask. The time for questions had passed. Now, there was only the cold, hard necessity of the hunt. The rebellion began in the quietest corners of Sarah's mind. It was a slow-burning realization that by accepting the white pill every night, she was complicit in her own erasure. She was allowing Ethan to curate her reality, to prune away the parts of her life that were too messy or painful for him to manage. In his quest to save her, he had turned her into a ghost. And Sarah was tired of being dead. She looked at the shadows in the corners of their bedroom, shadows that seemed to grow longer and more predatory with every passing hour, and she decided that she would rather be broken and knowing than healed and ignorant. She could no longer live in a house of shadows, where love was expressed through sedation and loyalty was measured in lies. Preparation was a delicate, agonizing process. She spent the afternoon testing the limits of her own endurance, walking laps around the living room to ensure her heart could handle the surge of adrenaline she knew was coming. She felt like a soldier prepping for a midnight raid in her own sanctuary. She found a pair of dark sneakers she hadn't worn since before the surgery and hid them under the bed. She tucked a small flashlight and her car keys into the pocket of her darkest cardigan. Every movement felt like a betrayal of the man who had supposedly sacrificed everything for her, but the sting of his paper cut lie was a stronger motivator than guilt. When 10 p.m. arrived, the air in the bedroom felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by lead. Sarah sat propped up against the pillows, her book resting unread in her lap, her ears straining for the sound of his footsteps. When the door finally creaked open, she felt a shiver of pure, cold terror. This was the moment. Ethan looked worse than he had on their anniversary. His face was a map of exhaustion, the skin beneath his eyes so dark it looked bruised. He carried the glass of water with a hand that shook so violently the liquid sloshed against the rim. On the small ceramic saucer lay the white pill, the tiny, chalky gatekeeper of her consciousness. He didn't speak as he approached the bed. He didn't have the strength for the usual vitamin preamble. He simply held it out to her, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, unable to meet her eyes. "Time, Sarah," he whispered. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammer strike of her heart. This was the climax of her internal struggle, the point of no return. As she reached for the glass, she felt a wave of profound sorrow. She saw the man she loved, the man who had once been so full of light, reduced to this trembling, secretive shadow. For a split second, she wanted to drop the act, to grab his hands and scream for the truth. But she knew that if she did, he would only give her more mercy. He would give her more lies to keep her safe. She performed the sleight of hand with a precision she didn't know she possessed. As she took the saucer from him, she coughed, bringing her hand to her mouth in a natural, practiced gesture. In that heartbeat of distraction, she swept the pill from the ceramic and tucked it into the deep fold between her cheek and her gums. She took a long, exaggerated swallow of the water, the cool liquid sliding down her throat, leaving the dry, bitter tablet behind. "Sleep well, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice thick with a strange, morning quality. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. His lips felt like ice against her skin. "You too, Ethan," she whispered, her heart breaking at the double meaning. She watched him turn off the lamp. She watched him retreat into the hallway, the sliver of light from the door narrowing until it vanished. Then, the real vigil began. Sarah lay perfectly still in the absolute dark. The white pill was a hot coal against her gums, stinging with a chemical bitterness. She waited 5 minutes, then 10, listening to the rhythm of her own breath. When she was certain Ethan had gone downstairs, she sat up and spat the pill into a tissue she had hidden under her pillow. She felt a surge of triumph, followed immediately by a terrifying, hollow dread. She was awake. For the first time in months, she was conscious in the graveyard hours. The house felt different in the dark. It felt like a living thing, breathing and shifting around her. She heard the distant, muffled sounds of Ethan in the bathroom, the rush of water, the click of a cabinet, the rustle of clothes. These were the sounds of a man preparing for a transformation. She stayed under the covers, her eyes wide, staring at the ceiling until the patterns of the shadows began to swim. She felt like a child waiting for a monster to emerge from the closet. Only the monster was her husband, and the closet was their life. Time became elastic. Every minute felt like an hour. She heard Ethan descend the stairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She heard the front door open, the faint whistle of the night wind through the foyer, and the heavy, definitive click of the deadbolt. Sarah didn't move yet. She waited for the sound of the truck. When the engine turned over, a low, guttering growl that vibrated through the floorboards, she finally threw back the blankets. Her body felt light, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and righteous fury. She moved to the window, peeling back the edge of the blind just enough to see the taillights of Ethan's truck as it pulled out of the driveway. He didn't have his headlights on at first, as if he were trying to steal away without waking the world. He looked like a predator leaving the nest, a shadow returning to the dark. Sarah stood in the center of the dark bedroom, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She looked at the bed, the place where she was supposed to be recovering, the place where she was supposed to be safe. It looked like a cage. She realized then that she wasn't just following Ethan to find out if he was cheating. She was following him to reclaim her own life. She was following him because the silence of the house was more dangerous than whatever truth lay at the end of the road. She moved with a silent, frantic energy. She pulled on her sneakers, the laces slick with her sweat. She grabbed her cardigan and her keys. As she walked down the stairs, she felt the ghost of a marriage walking beside her, a cold wind at her back. She didn't look at the kitchen table where the cold anniversary dinner had sat. She didn't look at the photos on the mantle of the people they used to be. When she stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air hit her like a bucket of ice water. It was sharp, real and visceral. 4 months, she had been wrapped in the warm, artificial cocoon of the white pill. Now, the world was raw and unbuffered. She saw the wet pavement, the swaying branches of the trees, and the distant, fading red glow of Ethan's truck. "I'm awake, Ethan," she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling but certain. "And I'm not going back to sleep." She climbed into her own car, the engine starting with a whisper that felt like a shout in the quiet suburb. She didn't turn on her lights until she reached the end of the block. She was a shadow following a shadow, a rebellion of one, heading toward a truth that she knew would either set her free or destroy the very heart she had fought so hard to keep beating. The rain began as a fine mist, but by the time Sarah reached the edge of their neighborhood, it had transformed into a heavy, relentless downpour that turned the world into a smudge of charcoal and neon. The windshield wipers of her car hissed back and forth. Swipe, breathe, swipe, breathe, a mechanical rhythm that seemed to be trying to stabilize her own erratic pulse. She kept a cautious distance, trailing Ethan's beat-up truck by 2 car lengths, her headlights dimmed to a low amber glow. She felt like a hunter, but as the familiar, manicured streets of their suburb faded in the rearview mirror, she felt more like the prey, being led deeper and deeper into a forest of steel and rust. Leaving the suburbs felt like crossing an invisible border into a different country. For years, their life had been bounded by the safe zones, The organic grocery stores with their bright displays, the quiet cul-de-sacs where the loudest sound was a leaf blower, and the glass-fronted office buildings where Ethan supposedly spent his days. But as Ethan took the off-ramp toward the south end of the city, the landscape began to fracture. The lush greenery of the residential hills gave way to the jagged, skeletal outlines of power lines and the vast, darkened silhouettes of warehouses. The streetlights here were fewer and farther between, their light flickering with a sickly, orange hue that reflected off the rain-slicked asphalt in long, oily ribbons. Every turn Ethan took away from the city's heart deepened the dread that had taken root in Sarah's chest. She had prepared herself for a luxury apartment complex, for a cozy bungalow with a for sale sign and a hidden life inside. She had even prepared herself for a motel on the edge of town, a place of cheap carpets and temporary escapes. But they were passing those possibilities now. They were moving into the Soto district, a place where the city's ambition met its industrial waste. Here, the buildings weren't designed for people. They were designed for machinery, for storage, for things that needed to be kept out of sight. The air through the cars' vents began to change, losing the scent of wet pine and taking on the acrid, metallic tang of the sound, a mixture of salt water, diesel, and old iron. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel was so tight her knuckles felt like they might burst through the skin. Her heart, the mended muscle that was supposed to be her second chance at life, felt heavy and cold, a stone sinking in her chest. She watched the red glow of Ethan's taillights through the blur of the rain. They looked like two glowing eyes, leading her toward a truth she wasn't sure she could survive. The suspicion of another woman was still there, but it was being warped by the environment. What kind of woman lived here, among the rusted shipping containers and the crumbling brick of the old piers? Was Ethan's secret even darker than an affair? Was he involved in something illegal, something dangerous, something that explained the blood on his sleeve and the shadows in his eyes? The dread was a physical thing now, a cold hand wrapping around her throat. She realized that she didn't know the man in the truck in front of her. She knew the Ethan who loved French films and wore cashmere sweaters. She didn't know the man who navigated these darkened, industrial corridors with the ease of a regular. He took a sharp left past a scrapyard, the headlights of his truck illuminating a mountain of crushed cars that looked like a graveyard of failed dreams. Sarah followed, her car jolting over a series of deep potholes and rusted railroad tracks that ran like scars across the road. The sound of the tires on the uneven ground was a harsh, rhythmic jarring that vibrated up through the seat and into her spine. As they moved deeper into the industrial heart, the trail of rain and rust became a gauntlet of silence. There were no other cars here, no pedestrians, only the towering cranes of the shipping docks, standing like prehistoric birds against the ink-black sky, and the distant, muffled roar of the freeway they had left behind. Sarah felt a profound sense of isolation. She was a ghost following a ghost through a landscape of decay. The ghost of a marriage she had felt in their hallway was now manifest in the world around her, the broken windows of the warehouses, the graffiti-covered walls, the sense that everything here was used up, discarded, or waiting to be demolished. She thought of the white pill she had spat into the tissue. She thought of the way Ethan had looked at her as he handed her the water, that look of mercy that she now recognized as a shield. He had been protecting her from this. He had been drugging her so she wouldn't have to see the rust. He had been keeping her in the safe world while he descended into this one. But why? The question pounded in her brain with every rotation of the wheels. If it was just an affair, why here? If it was a crime, why now, when they had already lost everything? The arithmetic of their life didn't add up, and the missing variables were hidden somewhere in the rain-slicked shadows of these streets. Ethan's truck began to slow down as they approached a massive construction site that loomed over the neighborhood like a jagged, half-formed titan. This was the Zenith, the high-rise she had seen earlier that day, but in the dark and the rain, it looked less like a building and more like a cage. The skeletal frame of the structure was draped in heavy, black plastic that flapped in the wind with a sound like leather wings. A single, flickering floodlight illuminated a gate in the chain-link fence, where a small, weathered security hut sat tucked into the corner. Sarah pulled her car over to the side of the road, dousing her lights and tucking the vehicle behind a rusted dumpster that smelled of wet cardboard and old grease. Her breath was coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She watched as Ethan's truck pulled up to the gate. He didn't wait for anyone to open it. He climbed out of the cab, his movements stiff and slow, and used a key to unlock the heavy padlock on the chain link. He looked small against the backdrop of the massive, dark building, a man entering the belly of a beast. He didn't look around. He didn't check to see if he was being followed. He was a man on a mission, a man who had done this 100 times before. He drove the truck inside, the gate swinging shut behind him with a heavy, metallic clang that echoed through the empty street. Sarah sat in the dark, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof of her car. She was terrified. She was heartbroken. But more than anything, she was awake. The trail of rain and rust had ended here, at the foot of this iron giant. She reached for her coat, her fingers fumbling with the zipper. She looked at the gate, at the no trespassing signs and the danger, construction zone warnings. 4 months, she had lived in a world where the only danger was her own heart. Now, she was looking at a world where the danger was real, physical, and shrouded in the dark. She opened the car door, the cold wind immediately soaking through her cardigan, and stepped out into the mud. The geometry of his absence was gone. She was standing in the very center of a secret. And as she moved toward the fence, her heart beating with a fierce, terrifying clarity, she knew that whatever she found inside the zenith would change the meaning of the word mercy forever. The rain was no longer a mist. It was a rhythmic assault, drumming against the rusted dumpsters of the narrow alleyway where Sarah crouched. She was a shadow among shadows, pressed against a cold brick wall that seemed to vibrate with the distant, mechanical thrum of the city's heart. Her breath came in shallow, visible puffs of white, and her fingers, numb from the damp chill, clutched the rough edge of a wooden pallet. Every nerve in her body was taut, a wire stretched to the point of snapping. Her heart, the $250,000 miracle of modern medicine, pounded against her ribs with a frantic, uneven tempo that felt like a warning. But she couldn't stop. The white pill had been a veil, and now that it was lifted, she was compelled to look at the raw, ugly face of the truth, no matter how much it burned. Across the street, the zenith loomed like a skeletal titan, a 40-story monument to ambition and steel. In the daylight, it was a promise of luxury, of glass-walled offices and penthouse views. At midnight, in the drenching Seattle rain, it was a steel cathedral, a cold, indifferent place of sacrifice. Floodlights, mounted high on the surrounding cranes, cut through the darkness in jagged, flickering beams, illuminating the swirling rain and the plumes of steam rising from the wet concrete. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the gate where Ethan's truck had disappeared. She felt a sick, oily knot of anticipation in her stomach. Part of her, the broken, jealous part, was still waiting for her. She was waiting for the woman to step out of the shadows, for the mistress in the silk dress to walk toward the truck, for the laughter that would finally justify the coldness of their home. She was prepared to be angry. She was prepared to be vengeful. She was not prepared for what actually happened. The truck door creaked open, the sound echoing through the empty street like a gunshot. Ethan didn't step out with the grace of a man meeting a lover. He emerged slowly, his movements agonizingly stiff, one hand gripping the doorframe for support as he lowered his boots into the thick, gray mud of the construction site. He looked small. In the sterile, fluorescent glow of the floodlights, the man who used to command boardrooms and run marathons looked like a ghost being summoned back to the earth. A man emerged from the small, weathered security shack, a grizzled, barrel-chested foreman in a grease-stained jacket, holding a clipboard protected by a plastic sheet. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply shouted over the roar of a nearby generator, his voice a gravelly bark that carried across the street to Sarah's hiding place. "Miller, you're late. Get the gear on. We're pouring the footings on 42 tonight, and the crane isn't going to wait for your executive ass to find its rhythm." Sarah watched, paralyzed, as Ethan didn't argue. He didn't stand tall. He simply nodded, a submissive, weary gesture that broke something deep inside her. He reached into the back of his truck and pulled out a battered, yellow hard hat and a neon orange safety vest. The vest was too large for him. It hung off his narrow shoulders, making his frame look even more skeletal and fragile against the backdrop of the massive steel beams. He struggled with the buckles of a heavy tool belt, his fingers fumbling with the leather. These were the hands she had kissed. These were the hands she had accused of touching another woman. Now, she watched them slip into heavy, dirt-encrusted work gloves. There was no mistress. There was no secret apartment. There was only the foreman, the mud, and the monolithic weight of a steel cathedral. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air in the damp shadows of the alley. The other woman was the debt. The affair was the grueling, soul-crushing labor of a man who was trading his dignity and his physical health for the privilege of keeping his wife alive. She watched Ethan adjust the hard hat, the brim casting a deep shadow over his hollowed eyes. He looked up at the skyscraper, his gaze traveling up the dark, iron ribs of the building, as if he were looking at the face of a god that demanded a blood sacrifice. "Move it, Miller!" the foreman yelled again, pointing toward a service elevator, a rattling, open-air cage of wire and rusted metal. Ethan began to walk. Every step looked like a victory of all over biology. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic limp that Sarah had never noticed in the carpeted silence of their home. He carried a heavy coil of cable over one shoulder, his body tilting under the weight. Against the scale of the building, he looked like a speck of dust, an insignificant spark of life being swallowed by a monster of iron and concrete. Sarah felt a wave of profound, agonizing shame wash over her. She thought of the white pill she had spat out, the suspicions she had nurtured like a toxic garden, the way she had looked at his paper cut with a sneer of disbelief. She saw him reach the service elevator. He stepped inside, the metal gate clanging shut with a finality that made her heart seize. As the elevator began its slow, jerking ascent into the dark upper reaches of the cathedral, Sarah stepped out from the shadows of the alleyway, her face upturned to the rain. She watched the little orange spark of his vest grow smaller and smaller as it climbed toward the clouds. He was going up there, 40 stories into the cold, screaming wind, to work until dawn, to handle heavy machinery and haul materials that were never meant for a man of his stature. She understood the geometry of absence now. It wasn't the distance between two lovers. It was the distance between the man Ethan was and the man he had forced himself to become for her sake. The diesel smell, the dirt under his fingernails, the blood on his sleeve, it wasn't the evidence of a betrayal. It was the evidence of a martyrdom. He was drugging her, so she wouldn't see him, hustling, like a common laborer. He was drugging her because he knew that if she saw him like this, broken, dirty, and subservient, the guilt would be a deadlier poison to her heart than any disease. Sarah fell to her knees in the mud of the alley, the cold water soaking through her silk dress, the fabric clinging to her skin like a shroud. She wept, but there was no sound to her crying, only the silent, racking heaves of a woman who had finally seen the true cost of her life. She looked at the steel cathedral, this temple of industry and debt, and she realized that Ethan wasn't just working there. He was being consumed by it. Every hour he spent in that cage was an hour he gave to her. Every drop of sweat that fell into the concrete was a drop of blood he was pouring back into her veins. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the rain, the words lost in the roar of the city. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." High above, the orange spark of the vest disappeared into the swirling mist of the upper floors. The steel cathedral stood silent and cold, its iron ribs holding up the sky, indifferent to the small, broken woman in the alley or the man who was currently breaking his back within its heart. Sarah stayed there for a long time, her forehead pressed against the cold brick, finally understanding that the most terrifying thing about their marriage wasn't the secrets or the lies. It was the devastating, unconditional weight of a love that was willing to disappear into the dark so that she could stay in the light. Tonight, she wouldn't go home. She would wait at the foot of the cathedral. She would wait for the martyr to descend. And when he finally stepped out of that cage at dawn, covered in the dust of his sacrifice, she would be there to catch him, to show him that the fragile woman he was trying to save was finally strong enough to carry the weight together. The chain-link fence was a cold, vibrating barrier between the world Sarah knew and the brutal reality Ethan had inhabited for months. She pressed her face against the rusted wire, the metal digging into her cheek, as she watched the anatomy of a breaking man unfold under the merciless glare of the floodlights. The noise was an industrial cacophony, the rhythmic thump hiss of hydraulic lifts, the grinding roar of the cement mixer, and the sharp, metallic scream of saws cutting through rebar. It was a world of friction and weight, a place where human bone and sinew were treated as nothing more than expendable components of a grander machine. Sarah's eyes tracked the orange spark of Ethan's vest through the haze of rain and dust. He was no longer a person to the men around him. He was Miller, a pair of shoulders and a back to be used until spent. She watched as he approached a pallet of concrete bags. Each bag was 80 pounds of dead weight, a dense, suffocating mass of gray powder. Ethan bent his knees, his movements slow and mechanical, like an old clock winding down. As he gripped the sides of the first bag, Sarah saw his forearms bulge, not with the healthy muscle of an athlete, but with the desperate, straining tension of a man pushed far beyond his limit. He hauled the bag onto his shoulder, his entire frame lurching to the left as the weight settled. His knees buckled for a split second, and Sarah let out a stifled gasp, her hand clenching the fence. He looked so small, so impossibly fragile under that burden. He began to walk, his boots sinking into the thick, treacherous mud. Each step was a choreographed struggle against gravity. She could see the steam rising from his neck, his breath coming in white, frantic plumes that were quickly snatched away by the wind. He dumped the bag into the mixer and immediately turned back for another. And another. There was no rest, no moment to wipe the grit from his eyes. The foreman hovered nearby like a vulture, his silhouette sharp against the light, shouting orders that were lost to the wind but visible in the way Ethan flinched and hurried his pace. Then came the iron. A delivery of rusted rebar rods had been dropped near the elevator, and Ethan was tasked with clearing them. These were long, jagged lengths of steel, cold and unforgiving. Sarah watched him reach for a bundle, his hands, those hands that used to guide hers across a dance floor, fumbling with the heavy metal. He tried to hoist 3 rods at once, his body twisting in a way that looked agonizing. That was when it happened. The mud, slick with rain and oil, gave way beneath his boots. Ethan's right foot slid, and the weight of the iron rods pulled him down. He didn't just fall, he collapsed. His knees hit the rocky dirt with a sickening, heavy thud that Sarah felt in her own joints. The iron rods clattered to the ground around him, the sound of metal on metal ringing out like a funeral bell. For a moment, he didn't move. He stayed there on his knees, his head bowed, his hands pressed into the mud. The rain beat down on his hard hat, and he looked utterly defeated, a man broken by the very world he was trying to build. "Get up, Miller," the foreman's voice boomed, devoid of any shred of humanity. "We don't pay you to pray. Get that steel moving." Sarah's heart, the heart that had cost so much, felt like it was being squeezed by a giant, invisible hand. "Get up, Ethan," she whispered, her tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Please, just stay down. Let it go." But he didn't stay down. She watched the slow, agonizing process of his resurrection. He planted one mud-caked glove on a nearby beam and hauled himself up, his legs shaking so violently she thought he would shatter. He forced his body back into a standing position, his breath coming in jagged, wheezing gasps that she could hear even over the machinery. He didn't look at the foreman. He didn't look at the sky. He just reached back down for the iron. As he reached out, his sleeve caught on the jagged end of a steel rod. The fabric of his thermal shirt tore, and the bandage beneath, the one he had so carefully hidden, came loose, fluttering in the wind like a white flag of surrender. Sarah froze. In the harsh, overhead light, she saw the true nature of the paper cut. It wasn't a thin line. It was a deep, angry gash that ran nearly the length of his forearm, a jagged canyon of torn flesh that had been crudely stitched and was now weeping fresh, dark blood. It was a wound born of a collision with heavy machinery or a slip of a saw, a mark of the violence this place inflicted on the body. It was red, inflamed, and clearly pulsing with pain. Ethan didn't even flinch as the cold rain hit the open wound. He simply wiped a smear of mud across it with a gloved hand, a gesture of such profound, casual suffering that it broke Sarah's soul. He didn't have the luxury of pain. He didn't have the time to bleed. He just pulled the torn sleeve back down and gripped the iron again, his fingers slick with a mixture of his own blood and the grit of the sight. The anatomy of a breaking man was complete. Sarah realized then that Ethan wasn't just working a job, he was performing a slow-motion suicide for her sake. Every bag of concrete was a day added to her life. Every iron rod was a bill paid. Every stumble was a penance he felt he owed for the crime of her illness. He was literally building her future out of the fragments of his own body. The suspicion of the other woman vanished, replaced by a guilt so corrosive it felt like acid in her veins. She had looked at this man, this martyr, and seen a traitor. She had accused him of abandonment while he was undergoing a nightly crucifixion. "I'm the iron," she realized, the thought a cold, hard truth in her mind. "I'm the weight on his shoulders. I'm the reason he's in the mud." She watched him disappear into the shadows of the building's interior, carrying the heavy steel, his limp more pronounced now, his spirit seemingly held together by nothing but the thought of the white pill and the woman waiting for him in the quiet suburb. Sarah backed away from the fence, her legs weak, her mind a storm of grief and resolve. She couldn't let him do this anymore. She couldn't be the reason he broke. The mercy he was showing her was a lie that was killing them both. As she stumbled back toward her car, the image of his knees hitting the dirt played over and over in her mind. She saw the blood on the iron. She felt the weight of the concrete. And for the first time since her surgery, Sarah didn't feel like a patient. She didn't feel like a burden. She felt like a wife who was finally ready to stand up and carry her half of the world. The night was far from over, but the shadows of sacrifice had finally been illuminated. The man she loved was breaking, and she was the only one who could catch him before the steel cathedral claimed what was left of his life. Sarah scrambled back into the driver's seat of her car, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She slammed the door shut, but the thin metal of the sedan offered no sanctuary from the truth. The world outside was a cacophony of industrial violence, the rhythmic, bone-jarring thud-thud-thud of the jackhammers biting into the concrete, and the high-pitched whine of a crane swaying in the wind. But inside the car, the silence was even louder. It was the silence of a woman who had just realized she was living in a house of mirrors, and every reflection was a lie she had told herself to avoid seeing the man she loved disintegrate. She gripped the steering wheel, her fingers numb, her forehead resting against the cold plastic. The horror of what she had seen, Ethan's knees hitting the mud, the blood on his arm, the submission in his posture, vibrated through her entire nervous system. She felt a wave of nausea, so strong she had to gasp for air. This wasn't the other life she had imagined. There was no perfume, no laughter, no escape. There was only a 40-story monument to her survival, built by the very man she had accused of abandoning her. The jealousy that had fueled her for weeks, the hot, righteous anger that had kept her warm during the cold nights, evaporated instantly, leaving behind a vacuum of agonizing, suffocating guilt. "I'm being carried," she whispered, the words catching in her throat like jagged glass. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, more painful than the surgical incision that had once split her chest. She wasn't being replaced. She was being sustained. She thought of the white pill, the nightly ritual she had viewed as a tool of exclusion and control. She understood it now with a devastating clarity. It wasn't a way to push her out. It was a way to pull a shroud over the ugly, brutal cost of her existence. He was drugging her, so she wouldn't have to see him bleed. He was silencing her, so she wouldn't hear his bones creaking under the weight of her medical bills. Every breath she had taken in that deep, chemical sleep was a breath bought by the literal breaking of his body. Every heartbeat her mended heart performed was a debt he was paying in sweat and bone. She looked at her hands in the dim, greenish glow of the dashboard lights. They were soft. They were clean. They were the hands of a woman who had been allowed to stay fragile, while the man beside her became a beast of burden. She felt a profound sense of self-loathing that made her skin crawl. She had sat in their beautiful home, surrounded by the quartz and the minimalist lighting, and she had felt sorry for herself. She had mourned the loss of their vibrant life while Ethan was out in the mud, turning himself into a ghost to pay for the roof over her head. She had looked at his exhaustion and seen a secret, when it was actually the most honest thing about him. The guilt was a crushing, physical thing. She remembered the things she had said, the accusations of an affair, the coldness she had projected, the way she had recoiled from his touch because she thought he had touched another. She realized that the other woman was the hospital ledger, the $250,000 monster that stood between them. Ethan was cheating on their future with the present necessity of her survival. He was sacrificing the man he used to be to ensure there was a woman for her to become.